even when things appear to be going better for the BC Liberals under Christy Clark, they get the C-SPAN contract worth $8 billion in shipbuilding. Along comes the Boss Power uranium scandal. Along comes more community living BC scandals. It just seems like they can't get a break.
Back on Voice of BC with Sean Holman and Sean Leslie. Yes, the Liberals can't seem to buy a break, and maybe that's the reason Christy Clark is out of the country. She's in China right now on a big trade mission, and actually she's off to India today.
Yes.
Signed on paper what looked like an interesting deal yesterday, $1.36 billion in investment coming into a mine in near Hudson's Hope. But the Vancouver Sun today points out they'd actually talked to the people up there and said, what are you talking about? This thing's dead in the water. The First Nations are blocking it. What's this all about?
Yeah, this is a mine, the Gething project that has previously announced. So none of the money was actually new. We always see this with trade missions. They re-announce things that have been out in the media for quite some time. And this is a project that the West Moberly First Nation is adamantly opposed to. In fact, the locals up there said we thought it had been actually canceled. The Premier yesterday trying to tell us that she thinks that, it hasn't gone off the rails, and I'm sure discussions will make this thing a reality. I don't know. It seems like one of those projects that is probably dead in the water. There was another one she was talking about that hasn't been revealed where the location is yet. I mean, you know, the government had said to reporters, we don't expect a lot of actual huge news on this trip. I think they're definitely delivering on that particular promise.
Well, they kept their promise.
Yeah, that said, I mean, I still think these trade trips are worthwhile. I think you do have to get over there and lay the foundation for future deals and that kind of thing. But yeah, that mining thing was all smoke and mirrors.
But there's two very smart guys over at the Sauder School of Business who will say that these kind of trade missions are absolutely and completely worthless. And I think what isn't worthless is what the provincial government is doing in terms of expanding its trade representation abroad. I think that's probably a good idea. We've seen that idea before in the past, and it actually started up under Gordon Campbell, restarted up under Gordon Campbell. He started establishing these trade offices all over the place. But what this trip has proven to me is that Christy Clark continues to make communications missteps. I mean, for someone who came into office with a reputation as being such a great communicator, she sort of seemed to accumulate an awful lot of snafus, and it really makes you wonder whether or not she has the right communications infrastructure around her to support her.
Or is she not reading the file? I mean, politicians should. Well, Gordon Campbell was well briefed on pretty well everything, to the point of ridiculous. So was Glenn Clark. I mean, these guys worked the files. They knew their stuff. Cabinet ministers, people like Rich Coleman, Pat Bell, they know their portfolios pretty quickly. Is this a case of Christy Clark just not doing her homework?
It possibly is. I mean, look, one of the things that Clark talked about when people said, well, you left politics to spend more time with your family to raise your son. Now you're a single mom. Your son's still fairly young and you're getting back into politics. And she had said, well, politicians don't have to work 24 hours a day. We don't have to be workaholics like maybe Gordon Campbell is. And we can delegate a little bit more of that responsibility. So I think maybe we are seeing sometimes the downside of that where she's not maybe as fully up on every file as a workaholic and a policy wonk like Gordon Campbell.
But things like that mining project, things like the conference call that went out to ethnic media only and then was expanded, things like that snafu and the tourism document, right? I mean, these are all communications functions. These are all things that staff, these are all staff things, right? So who exactly is over there taking a look at the details? I mean, that's the problem, right? And I don't know why they can't seem to get it together, and it's certainly not the first time they've not had it together on these kind of issues.
Yeah, the government was lost at sea the last few months of Gordon Campbell. It picked it up a bit with the leadership race and her first few months, but they seem to be back in that sort of rudderless ship that nobody's really sure who's calling the shots or who's in charge here.
Yeah, and that whole, the tourism brochure where, of course, the how to market your business in China thing was prepared by the government.
Restricted gay tourism, restricted gambling.
Don't promote gay tourism, don't promote gambling, right? And it's due to the federal government, which wasn't true. I mean, just seems like, and still nobody can tell us.
This is stuff that should be vetted through communications, right?
Unbelievable.
All right, now moving on to another policy area, a contentious piece of legislation brought into the legislature, although the NDP will support it, is how do you accredit and discipline teachers? Here's Paul Ramsey, who I believe is a former education minister on this point.
The government is at war with the British Columbia Teachers Federation on a variety of fronts. One of those is the College of Teachers, a revamped College of Teachers, which they promised for about, over a year now. However, the proposal that the province seems to be putting forward has received a negative review from the current registrar of the college and a former BCTF president, Mr. Kit Krieger. Is Mr. Krieger right that this plan of the government's is a total sellout to the BCTF? Or is he wrong, and is this the best that government can do to get teachers regulated and, if needed, disciplined?
Paul Ramsey referring to revamping the BC College of Teachers. Sean, he's also referring to the fact that when it comes to discipline, the BCTF will no longer have a majority of members on panels that determine whether a teacher gets disciplined. They'll have 1 out of 3. However, they will have a majority when it comes to standards and professional accreditation. Kit Krieger, who was dumped as the BCTF president, which I wonder colors his analysis a bit, thinks this is a complete sellout to the BCTF. But I wonder, it seems to me the government's already got to fight with the teachers on the contract. They've got to fight with the BCTF on class size. Do they really want to pick another fight on this thing? So they threw the BCTF a bone?
I thought this was a pretty canny a remake of the College of Teachers myself by the Education Minister, George Abbott. The last person to attempt a remake of the College of Teachers was Christy Clark when she was Education Minister. Provoked a huge fight with the union. They weren't going to pay their dues. They had to go to court. The government had to back down. It's, to me, by reducing the union's influence on the key issue of discipline, they found the right middle path here, in my opinion. The union will only have 1 representative on these panels of 3 that will hear disciplinary complaints against the teachers, unlike now when they can have the full panel is all members of the BCTF, and we have seen many, many issues raised where bad teachers charged and convicted of serious offenses do not have their licenses lifted. Yeah. And I think what Abbott has done here is going to correct that while still giving the TF a face-saving sort of way to maintain their overall representation in the college.
Is it a truism of BC politics that no matter who's in government, that government's going to be fighting with the BC Teachers Federation?
You will.
And to a certain extent, all her actions on the education file seem like unfinished business from the time that she was the education minister. And she did have some good advice when she was the education minister from her deputy, Emery Dosdale, who did quite an international reputation being the Edmonton school superintendent. So, and of course, her dad also comes from a school teacher background. But, you got to wonder how much people actually care about this kind of stuff. I think in the latest Angus Reid poll, it showed that education was only a top-of-mind concern for about 6-7% of British Columbians. So she may be doing a lot on this front, but I'm not really sure if it matters in the long run.
All right. Well, Paul Ramsey, again, is going to talk a little bit about other labor disputes or potential labor disputes, because remember, a whole bunch of contracts are up for renegotiation, which is a big challenge. Here's, again, former Finance Minister Paul Ramsey.
Prior to the 2010 Olympics, the government of British Columbia negotiated labor contracts with most of the public sector unions. They did that so we'd have labor peace through the 2010 Olympics and well into the future. Well, it's now that future. Those contracts are expiring. And the Minister of Finance says the mandate for new negotiations is net zero. In other words, nada, nothing, nil. You liked it back then, you're going to hate it now. Is this really a recipe for confrontation with the public sector unions? And frankly, is it a recipe for enhancing union support for the opposition party, the NDP?
Provocative question there. I mean, there's a lot of contracts that are up. I note there's some encouragement because the workers at BC Place, people thought there was going to be a picket line around the Grey Cup game, settled. Members of the BCGEU, there's usually a pattern that's established in labor relation contracts that the first few ones set a pattern out there. Is this going to set a pattern for other public sector contracts? They agreed to the net zero.
Yeah, I think it will. I know the GEU, the main government employees union, had been saber-rattling really just up until a few weeks ago about we're not settling for zero. We've taken enough. But I think that possibly does set a course for the government here. I think the public sector unions are probably recognizing there's not a big public appetite for raises right now when the government is in deficit situation, when the economy is very shaky, and people are already concerned about their cost of living and their taxes. I think probably the government realizes that the public in general is on their side.
And Sean Holman, Paul Ramsey tries to make the point that confrontation with public sector unions, it reinforces union support for the NDP, but perhaps it also works the other way, where we've seen this argument before, is Bill Bennett used it, and others have, well, who's running this province? Yeah. Is it the government or is it the public sector unions? And that is something that might play more to Christy Clark's favor than not.
Yeah, to a certain extent, although, you take a look at the fundraising numbers, actually, and support from the union movement to the NDP in terms of dollars has gone up dramatically. Like, it's gone up dramatically. I did a little analysis a little while ago that showed the BCGU, I think, actually is the top contributor to the NDP. So, to a certain extent, there's nowhere to go but down, but I don't think it's going to go down in terms of their support, and certainly with Adrian Dix on the rise, the NDP on the rise, I think you're just going to see those donation numbers increase.
Although I haven't seen any promise by Adrian Dix to reverse the 0% wage mandate.
No, but it's just like, look, it's just like business and the Liberals, right? Even if the Liberals were going, even if the Liberals were going, have to raise the minimum wage, which they have, they're still going to support the exactly. That's right.
Now back to the BCTF. Is it inevitable we're seeing an imposed contract on the teachers?
I absolutely think it's inevitable to see some kind of imposed contract. Almost every single labor dispute has resulted in that. The exception being 2006, when the government was flush with money and they brought in Vince Reddy and they gave a big raise of 16% to the BCTF and a signing bonus up to $4,000. That's not happening again. I
also wonder whether the imposed contract will have some of the concessions BCPC, the employer, is looking for right now. The most contentious one, I think, is stripping seniority out of the contract as a determinant in moving teachers around the system. That's what principals have been fighting for a long time, and as it stands now, that may be part of the contract. Is that going to lead to another court case?
Well, it might do. I mean, as we've seen, the BCTF is quite willing to go to court. They filed another court action over anti-bullying, I believe, most recently, so absolutely it could. But again, I think the Liberals feel, unlike in 05, when the teachers went out on strike in 05, and they had about 70% public support then, I think the government and probably the TF at this point realized that they wouldn't get that kind of support.
All right, well, we're going to leave teachers aside for now and move on to everybody's favorite Crown Corporation in the news these days, all for the wrong reasons usually. That's BC Hydro. And coming to a side of your house near you are smart meters. Here's Rich Holman talking about that.
It saves money. It saves money so we can keep rates down. We're already saved 2% on the rates. We've installed 250,000 meters today, as of today. We will be at 500,000 by the end of December. The resistance has been 0.015% of people have actually said no to the smart meters, and then when we talk to them and explain them, about 50% of those people take them once the understanding is there. It's a bit of a boondoggle to say that there's all the things that they're throwing at it, because people are just trying to be resistant. This will actually prove, I'm convinced, to be one of the best things we've done with BC Hydro and the electrical grid in British Columbia in probably a generation.
Oh yes, the suspicious smart meters. Is this going to turn into another one of these anti-HST rallying points for people?
Well, and of course, Bill Vander Zalm is very much against the smart meter program. I don't think so. I mean, the HST was opposed by a majority of the population. I don't think smart meters were opposed by a majority of the population.
0.15%.
I'm not sure I buy that figure from the minister, but I think, and I acknowledge that the opposition to smart meters is very loud. It is very vocal. They've targeted me on a number of occasions because I've said I'm not concerned about the health impacts around smart meters. I do think smart meters will eventually lead to time of use billing. I think that is what they are really all about. The government says no, but eventually I think that there will be rates based on, there'll be higher rates at dinner time and that kind of thing. I think that is inevitable.
I think the problem is that the provincial government removed the smart meter program from the BCUC oversight. I think if they had the Utilities Commission oversight on this particular issue, I don't think we would be having some of the problems that we have right now. And it would give a focal point for the channeling of some of the negative energy surrounding those smart meters. The NDP, when they were in government, learned the value of that in the whole entire land use planning process. And I think by doing things by dictate, like the Gordon Campbell government liked to do, they inevitably get in problems, and we're seeing that right now.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think people resent having something shoved down their throats without being adequately explained. They seem now to be sort of have it backwards. Now they're trying to explain the smart meter program.
Just like they did with the HST.
Again, this was really poorly rolled out in that they didn't sort of prepare the ground to say this is why we need to do this.
I agree with you. I don't see it turning into this massive anti-HST petition.
That's the only saving grace, the fact that the public's anti-smart meter support is limited.
Now, Hydro also in the news recently after the Auditor General, John Doyle, revealed Hydro has quietly been deferring paying down some expenses. We're not just talking about 10 million here, 20 million here. We're talking more than $2 billion, $2.2 billion, probably going to go to $5 billion over the next few years. Critics say that artificially masks not only Hydro's true financial position, but the bottom line of the provincial government, allows it to have a phonier, lower deficit figure. Again, Rich Holman's been on the hot seat on this one. Here's his explanation.
We know we're going to get dramatic savings because by having a smart grid and getting conservation of power and stuff out of smart meters. So we know that as we go out, we're going to get revenue, and increased revenue will help offset that thing, and that's why we do the deferral account. The deferral accounts are to say that so we're not throwing on the ratepayers back tomorrow a 50% increase in rates just because how we amortize our business. So the Auditor General, we will work with him to try and find a solution to this, but it's been accepted by Utilities Commission for a long period of time, these deferral accounts. It's done by other utilities, and so, now this is here. We have to look at it, and we will.
Rich Holman defending the deferral of more than $2 billion in expenses at Hydro. I can see his explanation, but again, it looks like they've been caught at something.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
it really does. And he mentioned other utilities. Yes, some other Canadian utilities use deferral accounts, but it's, there's a telling graph in there where it's about that for other utilities, and Hydro started to just ramp up their use of these deferral accounts. It looks shady, especially when executives get some of the bonuses that are at least partially based on profits that wouldn't exist if they hadn't deferred some of these expenses into future years. Yes, some of them will be paid for by revenues in the future, as Coleman tries to say, but as the auditor says, not all of them. Some of them have no future payment plans attached to them.
And Rich Coleman is doing his typical tactic. He's an old cop, and he likes to sort of tell reporters, he always likes to tell reporters, nothing to see here, go home, and move on, folks. And I'm just not sure when it comes to BC Hydro that voters are actually going by it, that we're going by it this time. There's clearly problems at the organization, problems that were pointed out by the provincial government itself.
And I also wonder, this seems to be an example of a government that, when in opposition, dined out big time on the malfeasance of the NDP at the time of hiding expenses, offloading things from the books, disguising the true state of provincial finances. Now, as you mentioned, Sean, other utilities do this to $100, $150 million. The NDP did it for $100 million worth of deferrals. Right. But the Liberals now will approach $5 billion in deferred costs, which have a direct impact on the bottom line that they present to the public and how well they're doing. That far exceeds the alleged deceitfulness we saw with New Democrats.
And in 2010, the amount of deferred costs just happened to put Hydro in the exact profit situation that allowed the government to scoop up hundreds of millions of dollars in a dividend. And it just looks suspicious, it smells bad, and people just think this is the government playing with numbers.
And you got to wonder whether or not the government is opening up Pandora's box, because they're actually going to be doing reviews of a whole bunch of other Crown corporations, a whole bunch of other Crown agencies, and who knows what they're going to find. The government better have its positioning right on this particular issue. They better look like they're going in and cleaning house as opposed to necessarily responding to a whole host of problems like they seem to be doing right now.
And they better hope Auditor General John Doyle takes a vacation and doesn't stick his nose in many things, because there's probably a lot more things to find out. We're going to take another break here on Voice of BC. Don't go away too long, though. Back for the last segment with the two Seans.
I'm willing to put forward my ideas against Ms. Sturck. I'm prepared to do it against Mr. Cummins and Ms. Clark. Let's have an election, let's have a good debate, and let the voters decide.
Producing over 9,000 hours of local programming every year. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
I'm an artist. My best friend is an amazing photographer. Our other buddy's an awesome athlete. All of our dreams are coming true because the Legion believes in and supports the talents of youth in our community, like us, like you.
Why not add your voice to the community? Become part of the Legion, to where belonging matters.
Missed something on Voice of BC? Catch an encore presentation of this show on your local Shaw TV. If you live in the Lower Mainland, Voice of BC rebroadcasts Saturday morning at 10:30 or Sunday afternoon at 4. On Vancouver Island, watch Voice of BC Saturday at 10 a.m. or Sunday afternoon at 2. For all other parts of the province, contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area. Or check us out online by Googling Voice of BC on Shaw TV, where you can watch this show or past episodes of Voice of BC.
The War Amps, it means a lot to me. Champ has provided arms for me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. They've given me mentors like junior counselors. Without Champ, I wouldn't feel like I could do the things I want to do with my life. I want to become a reporter. Champ made me into a confident and happy person.
The War Amps, helping Champ succeed, thanks to your support of the Key Tag service.
Political parties use negative ads to chase voters away. It's that simple. Collapse the vote down to the people that you believe are going to vote for you. And I think political ads, negative political ads, are part of why fewer and fewer people are participating in the electoral process.
Welcome back to Voice of BC with Sean Holman and Sean Leslie. Next week, though, tune in. We've got John Horgan from the NDP, the opposition House Leader and the party's energy critic, one of the more able performers in the House. That's our guest next week. Vaughn will be back here. At least I think he will be. But if not, I don't mind talking energy with John Horgan.
John's a fun guy to talk to.
And
he is a
also,
fun guy.
I said he's one of the more capable performers in the House. This session, we've got a break this week, about 2 more weeks after this. Seems to me Dix has developed a strategy to sort of be quiet and sort of start the debating question, but then sit back and let Horgan and Shane Simpson and Carol James and Mike Farnworth do all the yelling.
Thunder away. Yeah.
I think Carol James has actually emerged as one of their better performers. Former leader, of course, a year ago, going through the turmoil of being turfed by her own caucus. I think a lot of people thought she'd probably quietly just go away and maybe retire. And she said, no, I'm going to run again. And she's become, I think, a pretty good critic on the opposition benches. And you're right about Adrian Dix. He's had to tone down his own sort of firebrand kind of personality and show more of a dignified, quieter presence to sort of lead into question period and try to play down that dour.
And the Baker's dozen,
socialist
Sean
image.
Holman, who took Carol James out, don't look too happy these days, and they're not really given much of a role in
No, although you don't hear as many complaints leaking out as you used to. So I suppose Adrian Dix has had some success in that regard. It's hard to say whether or not everything's fine. I think we're going to have to wait until they actually get in the government to see what happens. But look, on the government side of the equation, though, I mean, I think what this past session has kind of exposed is just how weak the front bench strength for the Liberals is right now. I mean, you've got some of those ministers who are stumbling and bumbling all over the place in response to questions, ministers who really should know better in some cases, and there's a lot more experienced MLAs waiting on the sidelines who probably are pretty bitter about the fact that they've been kept out of cabinet when they see those kind of performances going on.
I think the BC Liberals need new blood.
They do.
I really think that they need new blood. You've got guys like Barry Penner now who've stepped away, stepped out of cabinet. You've got
Colin Hanson, Barry Penner,
used.
Even people like Randy Hawes and John Van Dyne and
When
Gordy Hogue.
you talk about Christy Clark's inability to overcome the baggage of the Liberal brand, I don't think you could really blame Christy Clark too much.
No.
I think the fact is you've got a tired government behind her and a fairly tired caucus behind her that is carrying the can. I still
think she should have pulled the trigger and called an election.
I do too. I think those polls. It's as may be, but
because it was just going to keep on going down.
She probably called an election.
Yeah, she should have called an election.
Well, I don't know if she would have got through it, but perhaps you're right. I mean, certainly I think as we get closer to the next election, things are going to look very grim for her. Not the least of which is if our economy continues to struggle along. The worldwide economy right now is shaking things up, and that has potentially dire implications for our province and the guy who runs the finances, the finance minister. Here's Jock Finlayson from the Business Council.
The weaker economy that we're seeing today globally has implications for BC, and it's going to toughen the assignment for Finance Minister Falcon as he looks to bring forward the budget in February. And the government is committed to balancing the budget by the end of its mandate. By my estimate, they've got about a $500 million hole that's going to have to be filled. So I think the Finance Minister's got a hard slog to find where the spending cut's going to occur or the revenue measures can take place that will fill that $500 million shortfall.
Yeah, probably made worse with the awful things going on in Europe now. Greece out of the way, now Italy, teetered on the brink of collapse. Jim Flaherty, the federal minister this week, announced that maybe the budget's not going to be balanced so early. He's restating some of the financial position. Obviously, Kevin Falco's going to have to do that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, first of all, Jock Finlayson with the mustache that I envy there, by the way. It's a full-on stash going on.
He's had that one for a very long time.
Yes, he has.
In fairness, you haven't been growing it for quite so long.
One week.
Yours has gotten lighter during the program.
Thank you, yes. It's a lot of gray hair in there, sadly. I think you're right. I think Kevin Falco, when I asked him about it a week ago, still was saying that the BC Liberals will balance the budget within their next 2-year timeline. But then this past week has seen, as you say, Keith, Jim Flaherty, the federal finance minister, come out and say, unlike what we told you in the election, it's actually going to take an extra year to balance the federal budget.
And that will give the provincial government, if they want to head in the same direction, some kind of political cover. And I think they're going to need to do that, because the alternative would look terrible on this government, a government that has promised to put families first. You can't be holding the line on the budget, okay, if you want to put families first.
And Jock Finlayson uses a $500 million figure of them being short. It's probably going to be more than that with slumping revenues.
Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, what is the point of cutting spending by $700 million if it just inflicts pain on families and on people for the elusive goal of balancing a budget?
Yeah.
I mean, I've always thought the average member of the general public can never tell the difference personally between a $200 million deficit and a $2 billion deficit unless the programs and services that person depends on are somehow affected by it.
Not try to say the deficits aren't real. I mean, obviously there are interest charges that the government has to carry, and those are very real expenses. But I think you're right. I think, this is not 1992 when people were crazy to balance budgets. I think people realize now that, there are programs that have to be funded, and if it takes an extra year to balance the budget, so be it.
Okay, and also, you used to hear a lot in this government when Gordon Campbell was running the show about climate change being the big topic du jour. You don't hear that too often anymore, a point Jock Finlayson's picked up on.
The government's throne speech and the new BC Jobs Plan, I think, signals that the economy is very much back at the center of the government's policy agenda. And that represents a bit of a difference from the Gordon Campbell era, the latter years of the Gordon Campbell era, where issues like climate change and green energy often seem to dominate the thinking of the Premier and the government. Now we're back on the economy and jobs, and I think most people in the business community are happy to see that shift.
Has that shift occurred?
Yes. I think it has, undoubtedly. We saw her back the Prosperity Mine during the leadership race. We didn't see a lot of green jobs talk in the jobs plan. And tellingly to me, she was up at an oil and gas conference talking about the fact that she was tired of hearing people say no to mines, tired of people saying, no, I don't want that tree cut down, tired of people saying, no, I don't want that well drilled. Talking about the fact we need to move to yes. That does not sound like a very green premier to me. That sounds pretty brown.
Going back to the resource industry emphasis.
What's she talking about in China is coal mines, right? I mean, one of the booming sectors of BC's economy is digging up coal. We don't burn it here in BC, but we sure ship a lot to other countries. Now, the government will say it's metallurgical coal and it's a higher quality, but it's still coal that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. This is a totally different government. Christy Clark has not got Gordon Campbell's religion on climate change, I don't think. They got a big decision next year, too, with the carbon tax. Its last scheduled increases for 2012. What happens with it after that is completely in Christy Clark's hands.
We got power lines going up to northeastern BC. We got power lines going up to northwestern BC. We've got cogeneration plants being talked about for natural gas. I mean, this is not a green agenda by any stretch of the imagination.
The carbon tax, I don't see it disappearing. I mean, politicians and governments become addicted to revenue streams, and they never turn off the taps.
But what you do with that revenue is up.
She has talked about bringing in transit as a potential benefactor of a targeted
which is a lot of pressure from mayors, even from the NDP, who have said maybe you use that carbon tax revenue to actually fund transit as opposed to returning it to taxpayers through some of the income tax cuts.
Still an NDP idea.
It could be, yes.
Is it an issue, though, if she can really make the economy and the resource industries the backbone of her economic platform something that is a little bit of a wedge with the NDP, who aren't nearly as friendly to those industries as well?
Yeah, although the NDP is feeling pretty brown these days, too. I mean, you look at some of the messaging that's being rolled out by the NDP and John Horgan in particular, right? It's not as if, they're totally on the brown side of the equation, but they're not making the same kind of green noises that they used to either. So I think we're seeing a little bit of a rebalancing here. What I wonder on the Liberal side of the equation is whether or not it opens up any kind of vulnerability for the Liberals some of the people who may have voted for them in 2009 because they were dissatisfied with NDP's environmental platform. Maybe there might be some shifting there.
And we're waiting to see, of course, what's going to happen with BC Hydro. Quite apart from smart meters and deferred accounts, this whole self-sufficiency definition, what's going to happen with the independent power projects. There's a lot of uncertainty there that has
and
a
they
lot
are
of...
looking actually at shifting less risk to the IPPs. There was very quietly they put out, they announced they were going to do this study about looking at whether or not to shift less risk to IPPs, and that's going to be something I think that should be watched.
And I still think at some point they will relax that requirement for BC to become energy self-sufficient by 2016. That was recommended in that government review of BC Hydro, and they haven't made that decision yet, but I still think that we'll get there.
Okay, that's it for the policy side of tonight's program, at least for the most part. Now into some of the more juicy stuff, and that's campaigning and politicking and advertising, and we've got David Schreck first up on that point.
What are the differences between the NDP Christy Crunch ad and the Liberals anti-Cummins, anti-Dix ads?
One was smart, one was dumb.
Well, I mean, Christy Clark, it was by all accounts, I think a pretty well put together ad.
Yeah.
Funny.
Yeah.
Was it, and Christy Clark makes this point, it's still a negative personal attack.
I think it was. I mean, that Christy Crunch ad was slick. That was the one thing. It would look professional. It wasn't overly nasty. It did call her mean. I mean, what was it? What does mean taste like or something like that? The John Cummins ads that the Liberals rolled out, and it was so clunky. It just wasn't very well done. I know where they're coming from. You know, as we talked about earlier, they got to sort of try to staunch that drift of.
But he didn't go down the polls. I mean, the ad.
But it's not surprising. Look, if you want to do this kind of campaign, right, this kind of hard-hitting negative campaign, it has to be sustained, and they didn't sustain either the John Cummins ads or the Adrian Dix ads. They just rolled those websites out, and they didn't do anything with them. Look,
Unlike Stephen Harper.
That's right, exactly. Because the Conservatives federally, they kept on hitting at Ignatieff, they kept on hitting at Dion, and they hit him every single friggin' day.
Well, I don't know if they have the money. I think this is the problem right now for the BC Liberals, is that they were having to appeal on their website for people to contribute just to keep the John Cummins ads on the radio.
But I don't see the value in it because they're essentially revealing what their line of attack is going to be.
And what about the Adrian Dix website? Can't afford Adrian.
I don't really have any problem with anything that's on the Adrian Dix website. I know the NDP feels that it's too nasty. All it does, I think, is draw attention to the 1990s, which is fair ball in my opinion. It is not personal.
But is that the best they can do?
That's the key question. Really, you're going back to that? Are we
back when he was a kid?
I mean, it was 12 years ago now. I mean, you know. They have to come up with some more relevant attacks on Adrian.
Maybe they'll find out he got drunk at university.
But it also tips their hand too, right? You know, the whole entire point of these ads would be to pre-position Adrian Dix before you actually get into election time as something. And now Adrian Dix is going to know what they're trying to do and be able to push back against that in his own pre-positioning.
Well, you have to think that they'll get a little bit better as the election.
I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. Well, it's going to be interesting. I think the NDP has a better track record when it comes to clever advertising than the Liberals do. I remember, you go back to the 1996 campaign, they had this very effective ad against Gordon Campbell, painting him to be some sort of demonic monster with this image of him glowering at the viewer on TV. Very effective, and I think helped define Gordon Campbell in a way that help them win that election.
And what the Liberals have lost recently is their very strong grasp of narrative that I think existed under Martin Brown. I mean, the 2005 election campaign was masterful. You had the government talking about, you know, look, we had to make some tough decisions. Right now those tough decisions are over, and we're going to take you into a golden decade if only you re-elect us.
All right, well, we're going to hear again about the topic of campaigning, this time from Bill Tillman.
The BC Liberals thought they had a great strategy. They went out to trash John Cummins, the new leader of the BC Conservative Party, set up a website, Can't Trust Cummins, radio attack ads, 2 of them that ran in very high rotation. And what does the first poll afterwards show? He's gone up to 18% from a previous 12%. Is that a good strategy?
Well, we've talked about Cummins. It's a good shot by Bill. But the whole issue of negative campaigning, and whether it's Cummins or whether it's against Adrian Dix or whether it's going to be against Christy Clark, how much of are we going to? Is this going to be one of these down and dirty elections where everything's negative and very little positive stuff coming out?
I think so. Look, I mean, yeah, with negative advertising, there's always the risk of backfiring and just highlighting your opponent. I think with those Cummins ads, that's what they did. You don't shoot at dead ducks, and it just drew attention to John Cummins and the fact that they consider him a real player. But I think this is going to be an extremely nasty campaign heading into 2013, absolutely.
Yeah, although you can sort of see Adrian Dix also establishing a positive narrative for himself at the same time, talking a little bit about, that we can't do everything, but we are going race corporate, we need to rebalance government. This whole entire thing, he's got a direction that he's headed in. I don't know what direction Christy Clark is headed in. I mean, she did the jobs plan, now she's off in China and Asia, she's talking about families. Where exactly is the Clark administration right now?
I agree.
I mean, there's no narrative.
No narrative. I go, again, look forward to the next election campaign. The leaders' debate's going to be interesting because John Cummins is trying to get on there. I wonder whether John Cummins actually doesn't benefit from that, because one of his negatives will be he's much older than the other two candidates. Dix and Christy Clark are sort of exude youthfulness, and John Cummins doesn't do that. And I think that could be something that is not going to do him much good.
And I think they're going to try to draw John Cummins out on some social issues where they feel that his maybe more hard-line conservative views on some social issues will hurt him with British Columbians.
He already made that mistake, though. And is he going to make it again? I don't know.
But that's what I mean. I think they're going to try to put him on the spot.
Probably.
You think Adrian Dix can go another more than a year being quiet and polite and not and being positive about everything?
I
don't know.
He's a pretty controlled guy. He is very. There's one thing about Adrian, he's pretty disciplined, right? And so if he has some people telling him, look, you can't do that, you can't fly off that, you can't, get defensive the way he does.
All right. Well, lots to talk about tonight. As always, on Voice of BC, my thanks to Sean Holman and Sean Leslie from CKNW. Tuning in to Voice of BC, bringing the legislature into your home, including next week with John Horgan, the energy critic and House Leader for the NDP. Join us then.
Accommodations for some guests of Voice of BC is provided by the Victoria Regent Waterfront Hotel and Suites, overlooking downtown Victoria's Inner Harbour.
Community programming on Shaw has been generously sponsored in part by